Hey everyone, so let's call this the first building block. I said I wanted to talk about language and how human communication works. I spent my life studying it. I worked in some fields related to this, and then I studied a heck of a lot to understand that better. Essentially, is the best I can explain to you this level why I ended up knowing or studying so much about this. So imagine you want to build a computer system, a very complicated computer system, and the knowledge of how a business works is in someone's head. And you say, how does your business work? And they're like, well, it's really complicated. So for example, I spent 3 months sitting in an office with someone who understood this entire business, who worked maybe 40 years in this company, understood how it all worked, and nobody else did. So the company's concerned this person's going to retire, and all that knowledge goes with them. So can you please get that knowledge out of this person's head? Well, that's a lot easier said than done. And so what I learned through the process, now I'd studied methods for doing that. Okay, I won't go into them because it's pretty complicated computer science methodologies for that. But I quickly realized the failings of these methodologies, because this person would use the same words to mean completely different things. And anyway, so we'll get into this. But once we understand the problem and what's going on here, it really is I call it a big shift in perception, because you will come to realize the limitations of natural language and all human communication. How most people are arguing from the fact that neither of them is really understanding the other person. And the question is, how can we resolve that? That's a much bigger problem. I went on to study brain sciences, and people in brain sciences, some of them have also obviously come across this problem and have tried to resolve it, but nobody really has, because why they haven't gets into a bit of a deep rabbit hole. And the truth is, as much as a lot of people will sound and say and make TED talks and write books and claim that we understand human intelligence, there's so many things about how our minds are working that we truly do not understand, even down to some simple things like how do we store memory, for example. So yeah, you watch sci-fi, you would get the impression that we know a heck of a lot more than we really do. I'm not going to go into that depth in this. I just want to give you a practical understanding of the human communication problem, so you have an awareness when you're listening to me and everything I have to say of the problem I'm trying to get around and all this important information that I need to get across to you. Okay, so let's make a start. I'm going to have some horrible diagrams that we're going to need to talk about this. Okay, so here I've got two people that I've drawn, stick figures. And one of them is going to try and say something. So this is me trying to represent speaking. I thought that was a freehand drawing, but I guess I should have given them a mouth, and they're trying to say something. Okay, the question, you might have asked yourself at some point, most people, is, I wonder how language works, like what's really going on. So I could go into a really long technical discussion. I have a pretty deep understanding of how language is what we call resolved, how it finds meaning, as the word people will use is meaning. We're going to delve down a rabbit hole into that. It's one of the earliest things that I started thinking about, to be honest, but it took me a heck of a long time to get answers on this. So, but it does get pretty involved. So we're going to try and avoid that. I'm going to simplify, as I said. And so here's what we're going to do. Okay, so I'm going to have lots of circles. Let's say that I'm going to start from the easiest example and we'll move towards where it gets more difficult. Let's say you said, oh, this speech here is 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, so in your mind, when you think 1 + 1 = 2, you know exactly what that means. You know what you're saying. You have what we could call 100% comprehension. Now this circle represents the meaning of what you're trying to say. What do you mean this circle represents the meaning? This is where the complication is going to come in. So I'm going to start with this. So if that's meant to be a dot. Let me try that again. How do I get a dot on this horrendous bit of software? Okay, there's a dot at the center of this. Okay. When you know yourself exactly what you are trying to say, there's a dot, and the meaning of what you're trying to say, your 100% comprehension, this dot would be in the middle of this circle. Bear with me. Okay, it won't become clear what I mean by these circles until I go through a little bit more. Let's say that you did not know exactly what you're saying. There's a little bit of confusion in your own comprehension of what you're saying. Maybe you're just studying calculus and you're trying to explain. Then this dot would not be at the center of the circle. It would be, we could draw it out here. It would actually be a we call concentric circle here. So the less you understand what you're trying to say, the more this dot moves out towards the edge of this circle. So this circle represents how well you understand what you're saying. Now, obviously in science we don't refer to things like this. So the science of this is called information theory. So what we would talk about is information. So if you fully understand that 1 + 1 = 2, you have essentially 100% information. But if you were confused about what you were trying to say, maybe you're a small child trying to understand that, then you have this information is lower and lower, and the edge of the circle represents 0%. So once you go essentially to the edge of the circle, you don't understand yourself what the heck you're talking about. Okay, so this is a way of representing, if you like, how much information or how much understanding, comprehension, you could pick your word, you yourself understand about what it is you're expressing in language. Language could be mathematical language, it could be a spoken language. There's different types of languages. Okay, it could even be you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics. How does that kind of language differ? Well, it really doesn't that much. All language is the same thing. You're trying to represent information with symbols. Okay, so that's where we start out. There's a commonality. They could be numbers or symbols, hieroglyphics are symbols. It could even be shapes or symbols. In that sense, the mind, our brains, are going through the same thing. We're trying to represent some kind of information, and we ourselves have a varying degree of understanding of that information in our own minds. Okay, for the sake of this example, first example, I want to make it simple, so I'm going to say your dot is at the center of this understanding circle, if you like, and you have 100% understanding. So the example of 1 + 1 = 2. I hope that makes some sense. It's quite difficult to explain these ideas. This is as simple as I can go, as I said in the intro, without making it so simple that it's not useful. Okay, so we have to understand this idea that we ourselves don't always have 100%, we would call information or understanding or comprehension of what we're saying. Okay, I think we've all experienced that. But in this case, you do. Now the person listens to you, and let's say that this person is a 1-year-old child, and you're saying 1 + 1 = 2. In their case here, again, their ability to comprehend what you're saying would be at the edge of the circle. They don't really understand what you're saying because they haven't studied this before, even though to you this is the simplest thing in the world and you have a 100% understanding. Remember, your dot's at the center of the circle. Okay, I'm picking math for a reason, and we will discuss. This is something I thought about very early on, was, well, why in mathematics can we reach this much higher level of communication and lack of misunderstanding? There's still some misunderstanding for the reason I've just showed you here. It relies on the knowledge level of the two people talking. But if in science and mathematics, if both people have the same level of math, they will mostly be able to reach, both of them, the center of the dot. Okay, because for this reason. Okay, so, well, the reason is that there's rules of mathematics we call logic rules. They're actually called axioms. I think there's 10 of them. I did study this once. And I would have to explain what logic is, and we will get into a long conversation. You know, I know people are interested in all these things, but it will take us away from what we're trying to talk about. And my mind tends to work like that, and I would love to talk to people and go in and all, but I'll be talking for 20 hours straight, you know, bringing in all sorts of things. So it's very interesting, but it's not going to help you understand this language issue. Okay, so now I want to change this example. Okay, now so I've given you the example whether the person themselves understands. So even within mathematics, which has the potential for 100%, so if both parties can get the dot in the center, what we'd say is that the information exchange is, you know, you could say 100%. Another way of saying this from a different type of theory is called signal to noise. The information is the signal that you're trying to get through, and if this guy has or gal has 100% understanding and this person ends up at 50% because they didn't have a full understanding of this math, then there would only have been 50% signal and 50% what we call noise. So we can talk about a signal, gosh, this is horrible to write in, I apologize. A signal to noise is another way of saying it. Obviously you want 100% signal and no noise, but it relies on your own comprehension and the other person's comprehension in every conversation, and rarely is there 100% signal to noise or 100% information exchange, because often we don't have a full comprehension of whatever it is we're saying, or the other person, even in the case of math, doesn't, if they don't have a full understanding. Again, for example, you know, I could put some more advanced maths here, which those of you who've done it, I could put something like this is not very advanced, but for the sake of it, this is called an integral. Integrate x squared dx. Okay, it's actually not that complicated, but if you've never done this math, you would look at that and you would say, in my head this is simple and I have my dot in the middle, but if you've never studied it, you have no clue what the heck that is. And we always joke about sci-fi, they always put stuff like this on the boards to imply like advanced math. It really isn't. But okay, so that illustrates my point. Okay, or I could put all sorts of weird symbols up here, which if you haven't seen, you know, this kind of math, you'd be, you know, no idea what this person's doing. So even with what I'm saying is, even within something that has the potential to fully exchange information, it still totally relies on both parties' comprehension. So that's why even within the realm of science and mathematics, there is still argument, there is still debate, you know. But if we get both people to the same level, then we can see that any what we call mistakes. So a mistake is based on this branch of thinking called logic, which basically means that, you know, some A follows B follows C, and we can actually see if there's an error in the information exchange there. This is why, as I've said, why we've made so much progress in the area of technology and science, because this type of language allows us to do that. Now I want to move on to natural language to show you, well, I'll make a simple example and then we'll go to the real problem of this polymorphic resolution, so you understand the issue that we're all up against, which very, very, very few people do because they've never thought or studied this stuff. So in this I might say I ate a sweet apple. Okay, now in this case the dot, it will be very close to the center for you in almost every case, in this case. Okay, but it's impossible for the other person to have their dot at the center. The dot will never be at the center. Okay, it will be out from the center, which differs from this example where there's the potential for both people to have 100% exchange. Why? Okay, So how does this kind of language differ from mathematical language? It differs because it doesn't have these rules of logic where we can force this dot of the listener, the comprehender, to move towards the center. This cannot be done very easily with natural language. It's very complicated to explain then, what we mean by these logic rules. As I said, just you've experienced this for yourself. You know how difficult it is if someone doesn't understand. It's not like you can write this in math and go through and see the mistake. It's not a question of mistake, it's a question of how these words are understood in your mind, which I will now go into a little bit, but I don't want to go too deep because again it will get quite complicated. So what happens is when you hear a word or see a written word, okay, so this is a symbol. Like we could have represented these with symbols like a hash. I'll just make up a symbol language. Okay, we could, like some languages like Chinese, represent words with symbols and not letters as we do in most Western languages. And you've seen hieroglyphics where the same thing was done. Okay, so let's just think of them as symbols. So we have symbols that represent things we've experienced essentially with our senses. So you've picked up an apple, you can remember what an apple looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like. So you have all these different senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. And so that is how you, what we call, perceive an apple. You have sensory information. So you have sensory data, we'll call it, on anything you've experienced in your life. Now if I said I ate a sweet goubla, you would have no clue what I'm talking about. You would understand a little bit in your mind about sweet, but you wouldn't know what a goubla was because I just made it up. So ultimately, this is what I say: we only comprehend or understand something we've experienced. Okay. Now I could try to describe a goubla and say it's a cross between a pear and a pineapple or something. I'm making this up, obviously, and that by reference you could try and begin to understand it. But maybe it doesn't really taste exactly like that. Okay, so this is where our language starts to get us into problems. It's always an approximation. This dot can never be at the center unless you actually experienced it. Now, so let's take 100 people and they've all eaten apples, and I say I eat a sweet apple. Obviously this dot, this understanding, is going to be closer to the center, but maybe you all ate 100 different types of apples. Some were bitter apples and some were sweeter apples. This is where it gets a little bit complicated. So I talked about we have this biological computer in our mind, and one of the ways that this biological computer works is it tries to gain understanding through differences, through comparison. So when you've only ever eaten one type of apple that wasn't, it was you don't know by reference whether that's sweet or not. You could be told that was a sweet apple, and when I say I ate a sweet apple, that's what you think of because that's all you've experienced. But then you go and eat another 50 types of apple and you realize in fact that apple was really bitter and not sweet, because now you have the comparison. Okay, so this is another way that our minds gain comprehension, is through comparison. So we basically have this constant experiences through our senses. I'm trying to represent this like a loop. We're constantly gaining experience, and as we ate more types of apple, we would gain more understanding of this word sweet. So the dot would move towards the center in terms of understanding what sweet means. Okay, so the less experience of apples you have, the types of apple, the less understanding, the less information exchange about the word sweet. Now here's where the first problem of our mind comes in, is that this is happening, this understanding, this comprehension, this information exchange is happening at an incredible speed. Now people throw this word around, subconscious, so I'm going to explain a little bit what that really is in this biological computer and information systems term. So that's very vague. Oh, it just happens in your subconscious. So you're not aware. It's not like you're when someone says to you, "I ate a sweet apple." You're not. Most people are not going to think about, "Oh, I wonder what he means by a sweet apple." Your subconscious instantly, without your consciousness, as we'll call it, gives you a meaning, a sensation of, you could call it, of a meaning of it. You can then go back and question that meaning with your conscious mind and say, well, I wonder if that's how sweet. I wonder how sweet. What? Then you might come back with, well, what type of apple was that? Okay, so this is how human intelligence begins to be very different to an animal, for example, other animals, because they don't have that ability to examine what they just thought. Okay, so we can call this introspection. This is what introspection is, the ability that humans have in their intelligence to sort of query what this subconscious computer instantly, answer it gave us. It's sort of, we feel like thoughts pop into our head, but they don't just pop into our head. They come from this supercomputer we'll call our subconscious for now. And it's so fast, and you don't get to question it. You could call it, it's happening really at a biological level. This is why. Okay, so our minds, this subconscious, our minds are what we call a patterning machine. We could think of it as a bit of biological computer software that have stored all sorts of patterns. Like in this case, the pattern that's stored is about all your experiences, I said, you've had of apples in your lifetime. Maybe not all of them. We don't fully understand. Like when I say I ate a sweet apple, we don't fully understand, this is all the science that I've read anyway, maybe somebody has done more research that I haven't come across, exactly how much of your past experience of, like if you maybe your subconscious is recalling every experience you ever had of apples in your entire life, or maybe it's just recalling the most recent ones, or the ones that just that day that your mind happened to recall. These things we don't fully understand, but we do understand a little bit about it. I did a lot of research to understand this, so just for your sake of knowing, I believe everybody can understand these things a little bit. So we know there is a process in the mind. It has a really weird sounding name, but I'll explain it. It's called conceptual clustering. So that in that moment when you hear this, I ate a sweet apple, out of your conscious mind, it's not your conscious mind, you have no control over it, this biological computer, you could call your subconscious, I call a patterning machine, does this process called conceptual clustering. What is that? So let's imagine that, I'm going to use circles again, and they don't mean the same as this, though that they don't mean exactly the same, but there is a relationship we will go through here. It gets a bit more complicated, but I think everyone can understand this. So every experience, sensory experience you ever had of an apple, picking up an apple, touching an apple from when you were a little baby, how babies put everything in their mouth and have tactile sensation, to looking at apples and tasting apples, we could represent every one of those experiences with a circle, okay? And in a way, they're similar to these circles. We could put a dot in the middle, and the dot in the middle would be a perfect recall of that experience. What, as best I can understand from reading people who spent their lives trying to research this, what we believe happens when you hear this word in like this amazing supercomputer at incredible speed happens is not every, but most of these experiences you've had are recalled. What do I mean? It's at a subconscious level, but you're essentially re-experiencing in a tiny bit that experience, and you can't recall all of them separately. So what it does is it overlaps all of these experiences. Like, you ever seen a Venn diagram? You know what a Venn diagram is? You could look that up, Google it. And then so all these experiences kind of get merged together, and at the dead center we could draw a dot here where they all it's called an intersection in Venn diagrams. So, and that would be your subconscious would then put that into your conscious mind. Okay, here it would sort of, that's how it then gets put into your conscious mind, is that meaning, is the sort of the merging together or clustering of these concepts of or experiences of an apple or sweet or 8. It's a little bit difficult to understand. I'm trying to simplify it as best I can, but that is what we think is going on. But there's a lot of things about that we don't understand, as I said. Like, is it, every experience? So for example, scientists have spent forever trying to understand memory, and what we know is that some memories will be, out of this cluster, will be recalled stronger than other ones. So let's say, and I know this is, whatever, it's not very pleasant, but let's say you bit into the apple and there was an insect inside that you bit into, and it was horrid and it was a horrible experience. You will more recall that higher in this cluster than you would another type of apple. So that influences this recall, and we could get into describing this as what some people call your emotional mind. So your emotional mind is the fact that memory recall and concept recall is related to our emotions. And so, without getting too deep in this, someone that I've thought and studied a lot about, trying to understand how AI or artificial intelligence work, this is why a lot of us think, well, I certainly believe that it's not possible to produce a human intelligence within artificial intelligence, because you can never make an artificial electronic as such. Anyway, we're talking about artificial as electronic. It can't actually experience the same way that we do, because it doesn't actually taste, feel. You can do what's called emulation. You can make it have the data, but you can't actually make it feel, which is why I believe that future artificial intelligence will move towards biological artificial intelligence, which we'll come back to when we're going to discuss transhumanism and other things, because this is very relevant, which is why I'm mentioning it. So anyway, this is what's going on, but the main point you need to understand is this happens out of our conscious mind. It's a biological computer that's doing this. The result is put into your, what you could call your conscious mind. Your awareness is another way of saying your conscious mind. And you do have the ability to then question that and dig down through this cluster and try and recall things. But the next problem comes out that most, like me speaking now, most conversation and most spoken language is very rapid. So most people are not going to stop a conversation every other word and say, let me just re-examine my conceptual cluster and question whether that recall was accurate. Okay, so this is literally, if you wanted to make spoken language like mathematics, and how I said when we have a difference, we can go through this logical sequence, these rules, and see why we differ and actually figure it out. Potentially we could do that with spoken language if both parties here were prepared to sort of dig through all their experiences and memories of 8, sweet, and apple, and figure this out. But it would be extraordinarily difficult to have a conversation. And so there's the trade-off, is what we call it in people who study this. There's a trade-off in natural language between speed and accuracy. So mathematics sacrifices speed for accuracy. It can take a really long time with mathematics to get to say anything, if you like, but it's extremely accurate. But in spoken language, it's extremely rapid, but it's extremely inaccurate in terms of the information exchange. So this is assumed in this sentence that you're not, you knew exactly what you were trying to say. You could recall this sweet apple. This other person is not going to have exactly the same, as I went through earlier. Now, this is the example I chose here is the best example. Now I'm going to give you the real problem, what I call the polymorphic resolution problem. And this is quite a bit more complicated, but this is so important. I spent my life thinking on this and studying, and once I realized about this problem, I realized that this polymorphic problem is what is producing most human issues, wars, all the tribalism and argument, and the fact that people can't resolve anything. It revolves around an understanding of what I'm trying to get across in this video. Okay, so if you can take the time and effort to understand this, and I understand that this is getting more complicated, it will completely shift your perception, because you will realize what a pointless exercise most argument, so-called debate, media, politicians, how it's all essentially very, very low information exchange. So let's look at this problem. I'm going to give you another sentence here to illustrate it. Evil people are I'm going to cut this out because I don't want to put it. It should be punished. Okay, evil people should be punished. Okay, so in these words, you had direct sensory experience in your life of them. Eating things, sweet things, and apples. Okay, I didn't put apple there. So you directly had sensory experience. The problem comes here is that the human mind is amazing, and we don't, again, we're getting into the area of things that we don't understand. Okay, this actually, what I'm going to talk about here, it probably, if everything I've studied and everything I have to say, it's by far the most important thing of anything I have to say. It's also, conversely, perhaps one of the most difficult things for the human mind to understand. Took me a heck of a lot of work myself. Used to meditate on this for an hour a day for like 10 years. So once you understand it, you will see why. So these words are direct sensory words, but these words are what we call, well, I'm going to call concept words. Okay, so evil. What does evil mean? In our own mind, we have a meaning for this, but it's not a direct sensory experience. Let me illustrate by example, because I think this is going to be easier than going into technical discussion. Excuse me. If I was living in the middle, like for you, like evil person might be, I don't know, a murderer, and they should be punished. They should either be, sent to prison or executed, whatever. But this is, so these words are special. They're what we call polymorphic. Okay, poly means many, like a polygon, and morphic means morphing or changing. Okay. Why are they polymorphic versus these words? Because there is no such thing as an evil person. What? Your mind has to provide the meaning from your experience. So as I say, I'm going to give some examples. If I'm living in the Middle Ages and I own a store, and a starving child came and it was about to die because it was starving, but it grabbed some food, in the Middle Ages they chop people's hands off for that. So for you, that's evil, and they should be punished by having their hand chopped off. Actually, same thing in Middle East. Maybe you live in the Middle East, and for you, evil is a woman revealing her face, and she should be punished by being stoned to death. We can essentially, and we could go on, if I'm in certain periods of time, or even now, there are people who say an evil person is someone who who doesn't agree with my religion, and they should be punished by death for not agreeing with my religion. You can essentially make these words mean whatever you want. That's why they're polymorphic, many meaning, that you provide the meaning yourself. So it is impossible for a listener to know what your meaning is. Okay, it is impossible, because there is only a resolution in your mind, a meaning you're providing. From where does that meaning come from? It comes from your upbringing. Okay, so if you were in the Middle Ages, it came from your experience of being in the Middle Ages, the values of the Middle Ages. If you're in an Islamic country, it came from those values. If you're in whatever it is. So I call this the cultural download. Okay, so it's the cultural download or program is the experiences in the culture you have from about 0 to 5 to 7 that gives you the meaning, the sensory data for these polymorphic words. Most people have absolutely no awareness of this, though when I say this, maybe this makes some sense to you. Um, Most words in spoken language are to some degree polymorphic. Actually, these words had a low level of polymorphism, as I gave examples, like, because the more experiences you had of apples, the more your understanding increased. But these words are almost 100% polymorphic, because you literally have no meaning except what your culture provides. Now, this is where we're getting into huge problems with spoken language, because a heck of a lot of what we're saying is polymorphic, okay? And it's extremely quick. So what's happening is that the person listening to you here is resolving these as well polymorphically to their culture. So in your mind here, let's say for the sake of this discussion, you know, evil people should be punished, whereas murderers should be sent to prison. This person, from their cultural reference map program download, here's my political enemy should be executed, or, you know, children who steal should have their hands chopped off. Okay, so but neither party is aware of the difference in, so there's almost zero information exchange, and neither party has an awareness of this because it's happening at incredible speed. Now, of course, if the person here has this introspection, the introspection can be to yourself. Introspection is querying the meaning of this information. They could have come back to you and said, well, what do you mean evil? What do you mean punish? Okay, and so yes, then if we use this introspection, we can start to, again, like that process with math, it's very slow. The thing is that people are not skilled in having how to introspect and how to resolve this, and so what you see in most argument, as I joked about, is just people getting angry, invoking their emotions, you know, anger, getting frustrated or whatever, and so they don't go into this like a couple of mathematicians. They don't go into this long, slow, careful resolution of these differences. Instead, they just get into a big bun fight argument where both parties come away frustrated and irritated and think the other person's an idiot. And so this is why I and other people that have studied this, people like Edward de Bono, who's the head of cognitive psychology at Harvard, he even tried to set up a school, and he was going to try and teach these things. But this is ultimately, you know, what kids need to learn in the school. This is one example of what I was saying about elevation and other people's ideas of things that schools should be teaching that are fundamental that they're not teaching. Okay, because it's much easier to learn these things in childhood, early childhood, than it is for adults. It's very difficult. If you develop a super awareness of this, it almost stops you being able to speak or listen to people, because you're realizing how little information is really being exchanged. As I said, I did meditations for a long time. What was I doing? We'll talk about that. That's what I call the work. And I tell people, if you want to escape this problem, the work is you have to develop this introspective ability to observe what meaning am I assigning, and then listening and introspecting for the other person. Well, you can only do that if you can intercept your subconscious putting these meanings into your conscious mind. Okay, this is getting a bit complicated, but you know, this is all the work I did. It took, you know, 10 plus years. This is what Tibetan monks are doing with their kids. Okay, this is what the kids do in those monasteries. They are developing introspection. They're not looking at that from a natural language. They're just looking at it in general. We'll talk about this down the road. Okay, but that's why when scientists look at the front of their, what's called the frontal lobe of their brain, it's much more developed than most other people. It actually changes the biological computer adapts based on the type of thinking you're doing. So this is a type of intelligence that very few people know about, that I'm calling introspective IQ. And some of us obviously have more of this, like everything, when we're born, but you can also develop it. I definitely had this very high, you know, by luck, because I even said at 10 years old I was thinking about introspective things, what is my thoughts and what is thinking. But I do believe everybody can increase their introspective IQ, and it would dramatically change our society, because we would move away from the constant endless, pointless media, politicians, and everyone arguing, to realizing what we need to focus on is this information exchange. And it's very difficult. I'm not denying that, but when it starts with developing introspection, introspective IQ, and ability and skill, and understanding these issues with natural language. I've gone over quite a lot there. I've actually left a heck of a lot out, as I said I would have to. There's a lot of issues here. Maybe I'll touch on a couple of them. This video is getting pretty long. Apologize. Okay, so I thought I said to myself, you know, just anticipate some things you might think. So it's like, well, why can't we make this polymorphic language? Why can't we eliminate it and make everything like this? You know, that's a very good point. Like, that might have been better, but you see, this what our minds can do with this polymorphism is part of what makes humans so incredible, although most people don't have an awareness of it. It's inaccurate, highly inaccurate, but it allows us to, it's very difficult to explain without me going into a lot of complication here. Like when I develop complicated computer systems, I use this property to develop them. And it'd be, you know, maybe in a separate video I explain to people how that is used. It gets very involved, and we're getting into how our minds are perceiving everything. So we'll talk about something called composition and association, and it's really interesting. And you know, it's really important for everyone to have studied these things in school. I go through them, all the things that I'm talking about, elevation. But it does get quite complicated. I mean, this began with, believe it or not, the earliest person I had to study was like Plato. The first thinkers were trying to understand how, you know, how do humans perceive the world. We'll talk about how classification works and all these things. So, for example, classification, as you've come across, you know, is a you know, a banana, a cherry, or fruits, and broccoli and carrots are vegetables. Now, I'm someone, this is basically what I ended up working in. Like, what I'm going to say to you, you're not going to believe at this point. I would have to go for it, but there is no such thing as a fruit. There is no such thing as a vegetable. These are what we call constructs. A construct is using this polymorphism to make categories or classifications. So we basically, our minds, the way that this patterning machine in your subconscious works. I'm sorry, this is a little bit more complicated. Maybe I shouldn't put it in, but so just ignore this if it gets too much. So what most people aren't realizing, the way human mind perceives what you're calling reality is just one possible way of perceiving it. It's not the truth. It can never be the truth. Okay, we could call it the sensory truth through this patterning machine, but any alien race, if they came down, would perceive things very different. They wouldn't be talking about fruits and vegetables. These are constructs as a result of our mind. What do I mean? Okay, our minds examine this data, this sensory data, and it looks for what we call properties. It looks for commonality. For example, in your senses around food, a common property is sweetness or bitterness. Another thing would be color. You know, anything you can tell with your senses. Roughness. So in this example, I'm not talking about biological classification. In this example, in your mind, early on, human beings, as they experienced different foods, saw a common property, sweetness, and called those things fruits, and bitterness, I'm taking this to an extreme, and call those things vegetables. You know, that's not exactly true. We could add more attributes to make that clearer. So maybe a vegetable comes from the ground, maybe a fruit comes from trees generally, and we start to try and make up these rules, and then we get things that are confusing. Is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable? They're confusing because these attribute constructs are completely artificial. Okay, they're not real. It's, you know, I don't want to get into, you know, this one will go down it, but it's like the thing about the controversy around gender. People say, no, there's only two genders and they're related to biology, you know, with your chromosomes. But again, I don't want to use the word illusion, but it's you're being fooled by your mind. There's no such thing as gender. Gender is something we made up. Okay, we looked at attributes of humans. For example, you know, your genitalia, male, female, you could call that. different attributes and said, okay, there's two genders, but there isn't. You could have equally taken those attributes and made up 50 different genders if you wanted to. Okay, it's artificial construct. That's what it really is. Now you could talk about biological biology and say, these chromosomes, that's a different thing. So they're not. What you got to be careful of is what we call is conflation. Conflation is when you mix two things that shouldn't be mixed. So your biological, air quotes, gender is different to your construct gender. That's why this is confusing for people. So I didn't want to get too much into this. And the problem is the biology, this computer, this patterning machine, you could call your subconscious, is doing this with everything and makes us feel that, air quotes, that it's all real. So this is what I didn't want to get into. But so the first 5 to 7 years, you'll hear me talk a lot about the first 5 to 7 years, is when you're laying down this polymorphic concept map, and these attribute classifications is another example of it that will get laid down. And what happens is, especially I understand it, during the first 5 to 7 years, certainly when you're a baby, toddler, your mind is able, your subconscious mind, this patterning machine, is able to, it has what we call a high fluid or high plasticity. It can easily change all these ideas. Okay, your mind is very open to changing your concepts of all these things, these constructs. But once you get to about, we don't know exactly, but let's say between 5 and 10 years old, it gets what I call locked down. Now your mind kind of says, okay, I've got my culture map, I've got my concept map, my classification map, I've got all these things, and this is what my mind is going to tell me is, where quotes, reality. This is reality for me. Why would the mind do that? Why would it do that? Because that high fluidity in childhood, where you can change that, there's a trade-off, because then the child isn't quite so sure of things. That's why it's looking to adults and teachers and school and its culture to understand. But it's more efficient then at a certain point to say, okay, I got it, this is what this is. It makes it faster in communication. But I said there's a trade-off between speed and accuracy. But evolutionary biologists believe that occurred as a way of preserving our lives, or survival, because most things come back to survival. What the heck's that got to do with survival, Mark? What are you talking about now? Okay, you've got to forget about words. Okay, think of, instead of words, think of just understanding your environment. Your biology that you came with, this machine, this biological machine, is trying to understand its environment and survive in it. Let's say you're walking along through the forest and a predator jumps out. You want to be off and running and not thinking, air quotes, thinking, we could call it, or having this patterning machine. How fast that patterning machine gets you off and running and recognizes the threat is going to affect your survivability, right? The slower you are, the more likely you're going to be caught and killed. So that patterning machine basically chose speed over accuracy, except in childhood, because I guess our biology is, I'm assigning saying it's intelligence like this, but I'm just saying your biology essentially understood that children are more protected, and so they could have this period where they could have this flexibility. But that's why we believe afterwards. And actually, something really interesting is that as conceptual clustering occurs, it actually, from what I read, releases an endorphin. So I with De Bono kind of joked about that people essentially are getting off on, or getting a buzz from words, and it's why it feels good to read, or feels good to have conversation, as long as you don't invoke your frustration and anger and everything else. Okay, because you kind of get an endorphin buzz from that. I often say, when you look at social media, this is really largely what is going on, is that people are just sort of getting off on their emotions and emotional reactions. So the opposite of introspection I call reactiveness. Reactiveness is when you have almost zero introspection. You don't think about any of these issues and language and what anything means, and you just run with this instinctive reaction to something someone says, and you just and then you just pile into them. You're a racist, you're a sexist, you're whatever, right? Without dialoguing this out and trying to resolve as I've gone through in this video earlier, the information resolution. So this is really what is going wrong. You're surfing in social media, and the problem is that people are essentially getting off and getting addicted to that. They're getting an endorphin buzz, as best we understand it. I'm sure there's a lot of other questions that, as I went through this for myself way back, that we'll come back to, but I think that gives you, why am I talking about all this? So I said in the intro, this is very, very important, because you have to understand that I'm trying to get across some really, really important information and complex ideas, but most people have this polymorphic concept map and all the things I've talked about in this video that are specific to the culture and time that you were born into, and is locked down. And so this is going to make my attempt to get what the meaning and information, the dead center of my circle, across and get yours to the same center extraordinarily difficult. You're going to have to let me go through this dialoguing process and try to be introspective and aware of this and not be reactive. This is what I'm talking about. If everyone had been given this in childhood and worked on this, it would be a damn sight easier. But in my life experience, very, very, very few people can do it. And that even includes, ironically, people who studied this stuff. It doesn't mean just because they understand it, that you can do it. It's like you might understand I shouldn't get angry, but it doesn't mean that you don't get angry. Even people who can understand this from a brain science point of view doesn't mean that they are, like, being good at introspection is a skill, and it takes a heck of a lot of work. And this was part of why when I reached about 30, 35, and I'd done all this studying from about 10 years old, I realized, holy, insert swear word, how am I going to be able to get this information across without being screwed by everyone's, we could call this programming, okay, this first 5 to 7 years. The problem is actually much worse than I am describing here, but I'm trying to just talk about language and these ideas in this video. There are other big issues. So please bear with me. I know this video is a little bit complicated. I debated with myself whether I should put this early on or even talk about it, but I just really fundamentally believe that every person needs to understand this to some degree, as best you can, to give, so that we can move forward. I just do not believe that humanity can move forward in the area of what I call judgment, which we're going to talk about. As I said, not, mathematics and science, sure, we can move ahead with that, but we're going to screw ourselves, we'll discuss this filter event, because of so few people having introspection and understanding this polymorphism problem. And you see it all around you in everything. As I said, it's not like people come out of arguments saying, thanks very much, that was so much fun, you've shown I was wrong and you were right. That doesn't really happen. So this is where we have to get to. This is fundamental to it. And I should shut up now because this video is really long. I apologize for that. You can consider this one kind of a TED talk, I suppose, if you want to call it that. But we have a lot of other primers that we have to get through about the mind. This is really just starting on the biological computer. This damn biological computer, who designed it? It's amazing and sucks at the same time. And this problem here I'm describing, ultimately, the truth is that no one really understands how we understand things. Like, this is why you can't go to Google and say to it, make me understand whatever. You still have to do the work. It pulls up articles, but your mind has to still read all these things and try and make sense of them. How does it make sense of them? So what I didn't get into here is how we, I talked about sensory data, but I didn't really talk about how we make sense of these concept things, because it's really, really beyond our full understanding. I have ideas on it, but they deviate from pure scientific thinking, which I will go into. So now we'll talk about your symphonic self. That what I'm going to explain is that some of the how we are doing this amazing thing with classification and constructs and polymorphism is not within what we could call the physical domain. Reality as you perceive it, it's somewhere else. So what? Yeah. So, but that I can't put a pure science hat on to talk about that. So we'll put that separately. All right. Take care, everyone. See you in the next video.